This episode of the podcast is sponsored by aleph-beta.org. How can we make Tisha B'Av feel relevant and meaningful for us today when the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was so long ago? These questions may be impossible to answer, but on Tisha B'Av, they are just as impossible to ignore. With Tisha B'Av approaching, I want to encourage you to check out Aleph Beta's collection of Tisha B'Av videos. Rabbi David Foreman, founder of Aleph Beta, who was a guest on this Farm Chatter podcast, has many videos which explore some of the most beloved Tisha B'Av texts to discover the deeper meaning and relevance of the day. And for a limited time, for the listeners of Farm Chatter, listeners get $18 off an annual Aleph Beta membership, which gives you access to all the Tisha B'Av videos, plus hundreds more on Parsha and other Yomim Tovim. And discussed this in the past. Aleph Beta's sponsored episodes in the past, and Rabbi Foreman was on the show. They have cartoon-like videos where he explains novel ideas on the Parsha and Tovim and other things. So it's very interesting. Check it out. The link in the show's notes below. So all you need to do is go to aleph-beta.org. That's aleph-beta.org, and enter coupon code SFARIM23, SEFORIM23, when you check out for $18 off an annual premium subscription. And that information will be in the show's notes. Just a note about the episode here. This episode is about Jerusalem from the 7th to the 13th century. So not an inherently Jewish time in Jerusalem, a very sad, unfortunate time, as we're now in the 3 weeks. I figure this episode is appropriate to post now. I think I read this book. I found it very interesting and enlightening, and hopefully you will find this episode as well, because it's not always a time period of Jerusalem and Eretz Yisrael that's very well known. There are Jews and there's a Jewish aspect to this, but it's not inherently that. It's not only that. It's a tumultuous period in Eretz Yisrael and in Jerusalem, and so different Muslim kings, there's crusades, there's a lot of different things going on. The Byzantines, there's a lot of different things going on. So, if you're not familiar with this time period, find it enlightening. And again, it's just, story of the post-Churban of the Gullus and of what happened, in Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim. With that, a couple other notes. First of all, just a programming note. I want to mention that Farm Chatter started off on Twitter, posting new Svarim and things, but for a variety of reasons, decided that the time is right, I think. We'll see. I started a forum. So there's now a farmchatter.com website where you can check out some blog. We post once in a while. By the way, if anyone's interested in can email me things to post in the blog. But there's the podcasts are there. They can check the series, the Spanish series, and the Shabtai series on the series. I hope to index other episodes later. But there's also now a forum there. So you can check out the forum. For those of you that are familiar with the Eitzar Chachma forum, which is in Hebrew, hope to be a similar thing. So there's different threads. There's new Svarim thread, new books, which are admin only, and I'll post things there and you can respond. And then there's also there's a new English forum, and then there's a thread about the podcast. You can make your own, talk about whatever, and you can just look at it. And if you want to comment, please do. Please sign up as a user and to talk there. Hopefully, it's a place where we can talk Jewish history and Svarim books, and hopefully. So check it out. I'll put the link in the show's notes. But if you go on farmchatter.com, it says forum right there. It's right there. You can go. I think it's forum.farmchatter, but if you go on the website, regularfarmchatter.com, it comes up. Also, if anyone wants to sponsor an episode, I've had a number of sponsors recently, so I very much appreciate that and thank all the sponsors and advertisers. But if you want to, you could $360 an episode. You can email me, it's farmchatter@gmail.com. Also, you can send any amount of money, even less. Any amount is appreciated. There's Zelle, QuickPay, it's farmchatter@gmail.com. And for all of you that have subscribed and rate and review the show, very much appreciated on Apple and Spotify, 24/6. Yet 24/6 doesn't let you rate, but you can subscribe there and listen there. And again, wherever and however you listen. And as always, I appreciate the feedback, the comments, the suggestions. So you can always email me those as well. And enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor John Hosler, who is Professor of Military History at the Command and General Staff College. And we'll be discussing his new book, which is titled Jerusalem Falls, 7 Centuries of War and Peace from Yale University Press, which is about Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, especially in the from the 7th to the 13th century, I believe, if that's correct. And Professor Hosler, you'll correct me if that's wrong. And we'll be discussing that, the book, but really the history, a very interesting history that the book, discusses and recounts. So thank you, Professor Hosler, for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Okay, why don't you start off with telling listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, and I will also ask you to explain where you work, because I read it there in the introduction. I said it there, but I asked you this before we started recording. I'm sure the listeners would also probably have a question about what that is and would appreciate hearing about what it is.
Sure. So I have a background in medieval history, and I studied for my PhD at the University of Delaware, where I worked with actually a specialist in the history of Jerusalem. But I didn't want to study Jerusalem while I was there. So I listened to him and I read his books, and I said, that's fine, but I really want to do English history. And so I started off writing books and articles about English history, and I spent about half my career doing that. And then decided after a while, I'm like, you know what? I actually am interested in the Middle East. I am interested in Jerusalem. I wish I had, known this when I was with him, in seminar. And then I sort of pivoted, and I just what I did is I followed the English leaders I was studying anyway. I followed them when they went on crusade to the Middle East. And that was kind of the touchstone for it. And so I ended up, I've kind of had two halves of my career, one studying Northwest Europe, the other's now studying the Near East. In future projects, I think I'm going to try to find ways to sort of bring those together. But that's what I've been doing. And I finished my PhD in 2005. So I've been teaching ever since that. I used to teach in Baltimore, Maryland, at a school called Morgan State University in the city of Baltimore for about 12 years. And then I gave that up to go work for the U.S. Army out at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is quite the change from the mid-Atlantic urban landscape to, I pass cows every day on my drive to work. So very different out here. You asked me about the college, the Commanding General Staff College. We have roughly 1,200 military officers who come from the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, as well as over 100 foreign armies from around the world, from allies and interests of the United States. And all those mid-career officers come and they do a year of professional military education. And after which they get qualified in a number of ways to take on greater responsibilities and promotions if those lay down the road for them. And we teach them military history while they're here, and they get a year's worth of military history. And it's more modern than what I research. We start in the 17th century, and then we take it up to the present day. And so they get that all the way through about March. And then after, I get to teach electives in medieval history, my stuff. And then I'll have some of those officers come over and we'll talk the Crusades. And I have a course on Jerusalem and that sort of stuff. And so it allows me to mix up the ancient, medieval, and modern in kind of a nice way.
Right. You're not really teaching siege tactics of Jerusalem to current officers.
No, not unless they take my elective. Now, if they do, then they have to learn that stuff. So they get to learn about digging tunnels and battering rams and that sort of fun thing.
So that's what I'm saying. But you do teach that, then you do go into that. It's not just like broad history. You do actually go into the tactics.
Absolutely. Every class we teach has to have some kind of bearing on military professions. So I get into it, and, we talk, for example, logistics, and I say, well, you have trucks and trains and, airplanes and boats and these things now. Well, this is what they had during the Crusades. They had mules and oxen, and they also had ships, and the problems they ran into were the same problems that we run into today. It's just, instead of horsepower, mechanical horsepower, you have actual horsepower.
Okay, so let's get into this topic. So as you mentioned there before, that when you started out, your teacher was, you said, I don't think you mentioned who he was, but you said it was an expert in Jerusalem, but you pivoted away from that. So how did you come back and decide you're going to write this book now?
Yeah, I think, I think it was just, some of it was serendipity. And I think I started reading some of the sources that he had been reading. And his name, by the way, was Daniel Callahan. He kind of a specialist on 10th and 11th century apocalypticism. And, I started looking at these sources he had talked about and he had looked at, started reading some of these texts and remembering some things from his classes, and just found it extraordinarily interesting, and really got into the notion of comparative cultural perceptions of warfare. And what I mean by that is one of my earlier books was on the Siege of Acre. And I found that, for that siege, every step of the way, I could read a Christian source for the siege, and then I could read a Muslim source written in Arabic of the same thing. And so you get this kind of point counterpoint, and they would give details and iron out each other's details, and you could discern a certain truth from it. And I just found that really, really cool that you've got these two diametrically opposed perspectives and that you could start to untangle it. I love the mystery work to it. And I just got sucked in, and now I'm neck deep in it.
So, by the way, just to clarify, the siege of Acre or Akko is part of the Third Crusade, right? You want to explain what that is just briefly, even though it's not what we're talking about now?
Yeah, the Third Crusade. This is the great expedition in the response to Saladin's recapturing of Jerusalem in 1187, and the disaster at the Battle of Hattin, which preceded it. So the Western states, they rise up and they send this massive multi-part expeditionary army to modern day Akko. And that's where it begins. That's where the crusade begins, and that's where they first meet Saladin and fight him again. And they try to get to Jerusalem, they just never do. They can see it. They get at one point where they can actually see the city, but Richard the Lionheart never actually goes there.
Okay, we'll discuss him and then the Crusades later on in the episode. Okay. So the book, as I mentioned, originally discussed the 7th to the 13th centuries. Why did you start in the 7th to the 13th? Why did you pick these time periods?
So I'm really interested in when the city switched hands. And so you have the first major in the medieval period anyway. If you want to do the ancient period, then you're going to be talking Constantine and these go all the way back to the Romans in the year 70 and that sort of thing. But in the medieval period, the first switching of possession of the city was in the early 7th century when the Persians took it from the Byzantines. And the last switching of possession was the passing off of it was in the 13th century, where the Christians relinquished their final control back to Muslims. And then after that, it's straight Muslim control all the way until the 20th century. And so for the Middle Ages, I said, well, those seem like good right and left limits because I'm being mostly interested in the sieges and the military parts of it. That's when the action was going on and it was switching hands. And so those became my measurements. I could have gone a little further forward, I suppose, towards the Ottomans, but that's almost opening up a whole other can of worms when you start getting into the details of their rules. So I thought that seemed like a good breaking point. Okay,
so let's start at the beginning. For listeners interested in more, obviously listeners may be familiar. I had a 3-part series over the summer. Discussing with Professor Guy Rogers and his recent book with also Yale University Press about the Khorban and about the destruction and the Romans coming in. So, leaving that, let them jump. So just kind of briefly from there, how do we get to the Byzantines being in charge of Jerusalem? And also maybe just a quick overview or a refresher for those that have no idea what the Byzantine Byzantium is. You could explain for the listeners.
Sure. So so in the 3rd century, one of the Roman emperors by the name of Diocletian decided to split the Roman Empire in two. The Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, as we just use them in textbooks, with the idea that it was so big, so complex, no one person could really handle it all on themselves. And so that sets the beginning of the precedent for this Eastern Empire, centered on this city, this area where Constantinople would be built by Constantine, and where Istanbul lies today. Over the course of the 4th century, so Diocletian, he dies in 305, I want to say. Over the course of the 4th century, the empire comes back together for a while, and then it splits apart again. It kind of does this dance. But by the time you get to the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire falls, and the only part that remains of it is the East. It's referred to traditionally as Byzantium because the city of Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, is built on the foundations of a town called Byzantium. Right. And that's why it has that name. Today, Greek historians kind of rail against that because when you read Byzantine sources, they never refer to themselves as Byzantines. They call themselves Romans because in their minds, they're Romans. Right. And so there's a huge argument in the field right now about whether we should use that word anymore or whether we should call it. But nobody has a good replacement for it. So you have this Byzantine, or if you want to call it the Eastern Roman Empire. Right. That survives. Now it's in the midst of all of that, you have the Emperor Constantine, the emperor who legalizes the Christian faith. His mother makes a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which lies in that Eastern Roman, the future Byzantine domain, where she purportedly digs up the tomb of Christ, finds the tomb, finds the crosses, and instantly it becomes this sort of magnet for Christian pilgrims. They're going to start coming there. They're going to start building there. So really, it's that 4th century that becomes decisive. That's when Christians kind of rekindle their interest in the holy city. Not that they didn't know about it before, they did, but now that Rome is a Christian empire, they can come out and worship in public. Now you can go and restore these sites. All of a sudden now, okay, people are going to visit there. And when the emperor's mother is there, that's the imprimatur, right? It's, if she's saying it's an important place, then we can all agree it's an important place. And so this, now you have the Christian, and then when the empire in the West falls, the Byzantine control of that city all the way up until the 7th century.
Okay, so until the 7th century, where we're going to start about 614, as you're saying, it was under Christian control, under the Roman Byzantine control. Right. How about but until that point, just interesting, who else was in the city? So obviously we're Christians. There are Jews in the city. I mean, what else is going on in the city at this time?
Yeah, you have Christians, you have Jews, you have. It's hard to know because the shtick of the Romans is as they legalize the faith, and then there's this demand. It kind of becomes the official faith. Emperor Theodosius declares paganism illegal. So the theory is well, if that's true, then pagans are theoretically disappearing, right? They're either hiding, they're not talking about it, or they're converting. Whether they believe or not is an open question. So you have Christians, you have Jews in the city. You probably also have latent paganism there. It's hard to know exactly how much. And then not too far away, you have these other sort of more minor faiths in terms of population, like the Zoroastrians in Persia, which are there because they're moving in and out on trade routes, they're visiting and whatnot. Are they resident in the city? Difficult to know who's actually living there, but it seems that even in those late periods, you have a fairly diverse population. It's dominated by Christianity for sure. And then Emperor Heraclius is going to really put the screws down on the Jewish population and start to repress them, not only in Jerusalem, but kind of throughout his domains. So life is definitely difficult, but there are Jews there, and there are Christians, and they are living side by side. It's probably not entirely comfortable most of the time. That would be my guess, but it's hard to know because barring any kind of really good description of, I was in the city today and here's what I saw. And those things are great. They're worth their weight in gold, but we just don't have that many of them.
Right. One other thing, I should go back for a second. Constantine's mother, Helena, I think she founds a church. Then it's her.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a temple, I believe, to Venus on the spot. And then supposedly a local says, oh, well, this is where the tomb is, right? And so they rip up the old foundations of the temple, and then they dig, and then a church is established there. And that's the beginning of this, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which goes through all of these different transformations and foundations. And that's kind of the beginning of it. So early 4th century.
Okay, now we'll jump forward to when the book begins. It's 614, the siege of 614. And you kind of, want to describe and lay the ground of what happens to Persians, right? They're coming in and they're going to conquer the city away from Byzantine Christian control.
Right. Yeah, the Sassanid Persians under Chosroe II is the name of the Persian emperor. And it seems to be, it's quite interesting, doesn't really seem to be a holy war per se. It's not, Zoroastrian against Christian, whatnot, although there are mentions of these things in the sources, but this is a very large scale, wide-ranging dispute between the Byzantines and the Persians. And it's fought all over the place. It's fought in Iraq, it's fought in the Levant, it's fought in Asia Minor, it's fought in Persia proper. Many armies moving back and forth over the course of 20 years. So really, really nasty fighting in between. And in 614, in the midst of this, the Byzantines lose Jerusalem, and it's not just Jerusalem. They lose Caesarea, Martima on the coast, all these other cities, and then their general Sharbaraz eventually marches on Jerusalem itself and puts it under siege. And that's the 614 is used the date I used. Everyone always argues about this. Was it late 613? Was it we don't have 614 is kind of like a generally accepted thing, but around that time, that's when it happens.
Okay, now there is something that you about the siege. There's kind of a massacre, and as the Jews are involved. This is what happens or purportedly happens here.
Yeah, so the story is it's interesting. We have one source that is incredibly detailed, from a guy who claims to have talked to somebody who was there personally. And it goes through all the details, but it's the best source we have. And there's a lot of questions about whether it's accurate or not. Then you have all these other sources that are very short, that, one paragraph, 3 paragraphs, and whatnot. So if we take their story in aggregate, what it seems to say is there had been, before the major attack began, there had been some domestic disputes in the city between Christians and Jews. And it wasn't really about religion so much as wrapped up in kind of this curious gang violence. It was almost, the sources talk about the youths of the city rising up. So it could be sort of fighting the man, that sort of thing, right? So there's this unsettling that happens before it. And then when the Persians arrive and actually place the city under siege and beginning attacking the walls, there's the accusation that the Jews who are local helped them out. They're so mad at the Byzantine governor, right? That they say, well, we're going to help the attackers. I'm trying to remember if the source says, I think the supposition is that they did something like rappel down the walls. So they kind of leave the city and join the Persians on the outside. And I would guess, give them some operational information, some intelligence, and say, hey, the wall might be weak over there. This door, Bob never locks the door, so you might want to try that one, that sort of thing. And then the Persians break through the walls, and they conduct this massacre inside the city. That massacre seems to have been done by the Persians. I think all the sources say it's the Persian soldiers who do that, and they go through the town and they're killing everyone they see, and then they play a little trick on them where the sources say they actually get tired of killing because it's hard work. So they call out, they say, hey, we know you're hiding. If you come out now, we'll spare your lives, which is kind of the oldest trick in the book, right? They all come out, they pull out, they say, well, anyone with a knowledge of architecture who can rebuild the city will keep you. And then they kill everyone else. Or they take them prisoner and they bring them to the Mamilla Pool to the west of the city proper, which is still there today. You can go visit it. And this is where the Jews come back into the story, right? So supposedly you have this group of Christians down in this pit with water, right? And so it's a miserable thing. And according to these Christian sources, right, the Jews ask the Persian guards, you get the guards around the perimeter guarding these guys, right? Asks them to ransom. Can I ransom some of these Jews and some of these Christians? I would like to pay for this Christian to get out of the pit. And the Persians like, fine, we'll take your money. And then it goes on to say, well, if a Jew ransomed a Christian, they gave him a choice. They said, I will ransom you and you can go free if you convert to Judaism. Right. At this point, the Christians refuse. And then if they refuse, then the Jew, whoever ransomed them, would kill them. Right. And then the sources go into these lurid details about these mass butcheries of all the Christians, and the numbers fly all over the place in terms of how many Christians were in that pit. Was it a few hundred? Was it a few thousand? Et cetera, et cetera. And then they all kind of come down with this judgment that the Jews went after these Christians and killed them. And then, as you can imagine, there's all these allusions back to the New Testament, and that they're bringing the crucifixion scene back into it and all of this kind of stuff. So it's really tough to read these sources because part of you is just saying, whoa, the bias is so pronounced, right? I mean, you can see it in the way they're phrasing this. You can see it in the New Testament references. They're clearly trying to draw a line to Jesus and these ancient events, and they're couching it so it's very difficult to interpret and find out what is actually going on. What I found is that every major source from the period talks about this happening in some degree, sometimes really vague, sometimes really specific. And so my interpretation is something happened. I think something happened, but getting a handle on the scale, I think is virtually impossible. Just because of the tenor of the sources, you can only really trust them halfway.
Right. So as you relay in the book, I mean, you kind of relay the story, what you just said, and you go a little bit more in depth. But what the truth, the veracity of how far it goes, as you're saying, it's kind of hard to ascertain, really.
It's tough. And, and I try in the book, I say, look, if you put yourself in the position of these Jewish residents, right, the more you read about how Jews were oppressed during the reign of Heraclius. I mean, all of these major urban centers, they get oppressed by them. And then later on, he's going to come back and oppress them even more. you can say, look, I get it. You have a chance to kind of strike a mortal blow here by joining the Persians and attacking the city. I can totally see why they would want to do it, right? This is your moment to resist. It looks like Heraclius is going down. If the Persians win this war, maybe you're looking forward to a more peaceful society, a bit more tolerance, and so the motivation's definitely there. It's just that the details and that's where historians have kind of been, over the years, have taken different approaches to it. Sometimes it kind of gets forgotten. Sometimes it gets talked about a lot. It just seems to go through shifts.
Okay, so first of all, the Persians at this time, this is the time period of Muhammad and Islam. These Persians are not Muslim, right? They're
Right.
As you mentioned. I think you mentioned
Right.
that. Just to clarify that. So I think you kind of alluded to there's more to discuss in 614 if you want to. I mean, there's a lot of how many killed and what happens, and what kind of happens to the wall and the defenses of Jerusalem. But you alluded to this just to clarify this. So then Heraclius comes back about 630, right. And then, as you mentioned, so what happens to the Jews in between, and then he comes back, like you said, he goes full force against them.
Right. So it's a strange story. So he's on his victory parade, right? He's the Persians have basically come to terms. He's gotten his cities back. He's won the war, and he is processing down to Jerusalem because he's recovered one of the stolen relics. The Persians had taken a piece of what's called the true cross, purportedly wood that Jesus was crucified on, right? He's liberated that from the Persians, and he's going to bring it back to the holy city, right? So he's processing down there. It's kind of this glorious moment. And supposedly he meets some local Jews on the road, on the way to Jerusalem, and they come up to him. They're like, hey, look, can we make a deal so we can live in peace? Because we don't want any more of these problems. And he's magnanimous, and he says, look, the war is over, and sure, yeah, look, I'm going to tolerate you. It's going to be fine. Everything's going to be fine. And then he gets to Jerusalem, and the Christian monks pull him aside, and everything changes. They're like, no, it can't be fine. And they start telling the story. Well, this is what the Jews did to us, and these are our grievances. You have to promise to deal with them. And Heraclius responds, well, I just made a deal with them. I just promised them that I would treat them okay. And he says, plus, isn't it, kind of wrong to murder people? We're not supposed to be doing that, which is rich coming from him because he had murdered plenty of people. But at this moment, he says, I shouldn't be doing this. And the monks just make this very odd promise. They're like, oh, no, don't worry about it. If you murder them, don't worry. We'll do a fast for you, and we'll pray for you for the rest of our lives. So you'll get to heaven. No problem. You don't have to worry about that. Right. And again, you listen to these stories, you're like, really? But as I found, one of these fasts is actually maintained for decades. It actually did take place. They did have this tradition of fasting. So maybe there's something to the story. Well, anyway, this changes his mind, and his heart is hardened, and he decides, I'm going to go after the Jews once more. And that is followed by, it depends. It's a little controversial whether you want to call it a pogrom, whether you just want to call it mass conversion. He sends out an order to forcibly baptize all of the Jews in North Africa. And we presume that includes those in the Levant as well. And so you get these stories, some of them purportedly from Jewish sources, talking about this and saying, yeah, forcible baptism, often on pain of death. And this kind of this Heraclean oppression kind of comes back. So I don't know, that story about him being temporarily merciful, and then being persuaded to change his mind. It sounds like he's had a change of heart. I'm not sure I buy it myself. This guy seems to be, I think you could write, entire books have been written about it, about what Heraclius did against Jewish communities. It's pretty severe throughout his entire reign. And so, yeah, after getting the holy city back, it's back to business as normal. It's even worse than before. These communities are being punished once again.
Okay, so although you're a military historian, we kind of skipped over the tactics and the siege and that kind of thing. But what about you could talk about it if you want, but what about the fortifications of Jerusalem? Those are kind of, damaged, if you will, in 614. And what happens in between 615 and 630 and then afterwards? Is the city still vulnerable to another attack?
Yeah, it's my theory that it is, because I found no indication in the sources of Heraclius paying for any repairs. When he gets to Jerusalem, he does pony up money for reconstruction of some of these churches because the Persians had set a lot of the churches inside the city on fire. So the holy buildings are rebuilt, but there's no money requisitioned for the walls. And in fact, Heraclius doesn't actually have a ton of cash at the moment to pay for this. And the tradition is that, these garrison commanders of Byzantine frontier towns, and that's what Jerusalem is at this point. It really is a frontier, a bulwark against Arabia. They're supposed to pay for the repairs themselves. So this wall was not adequately repaired. Archaeologists have actually dug down and found on the northern side the residue from the 614 siege. They've actually found the rubble, and what they claim is that if it wasn't ever rebuilt, if anything, it became like a garbage heap. So people maybe, if you imagine like a gap in the wall, like a large gap, maybe people throwing stones back into it, throwing trash into it, but no one really concentrating all that much on it. And that seems to be the state of the walls when the next invasion comes, not really fixed up. You still have that big weakness. Okay,
so I mentioned earlier, we have Muhammad and the rise of Islam. So we probably should mention that. When does that begin? Tell the listeners about that. We can discuss a little bit the different Sunni Muslim Shia. We can discuss a little bit about that and how that relates to the story here. But when the Arabs and the Muslims started, suddenly they're coming, and they're now coming to Jerusalem.
Right. Yeah. And this is all happening simultaneously, right? So the first, Muslim scholars argue about this, the first very verifiable date we have for Muhammad is 622. That's the year of the Hijrah, where he leaves Mecca and goes on his migration to Yathrib, which becomes the city of Medina. So that's 622. So that's after the Persian siege, but it's 8 years before Heraclius makes it back. The year Heraclius comes back in 630, that's the year that Muhammad returns to Mecca. So he's busy in Arabia, and then he dies 2 years later in 632. So all this is going on while Muhammad is consolidating his power in Arabia, right? When he dies in 632, the control of the faith, guidance of the faith will go over to the so-called first four caliphs, the successors, the first one being Abu Bakr, and they will start the outward expansion in which you actually start leaving Arabia, moving north, moving into Egypt. And that expansion is what's going to ensnare Jerusalem in the year 638. Just 6 years after Muhammad dies is when the Arabs are going to arrive outside the holy city.
Okay, so like I said, in the book, though, you do kind of go take a little bit of a detour. You discuss the different Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims. Why do you do that? And how does that relate exactly? Or how does that play in that whole background?
Yeah, you don't have that split until later in the 600s. But the idea is that the Arabs are not a unified people. When we think of Arabia converting, right, and this nation kind of rising up and conquering half the known world, certainly you have the Arabs who have converted to the faith, but you have Arabs who did not, Arabs who are living on the fringes of Byzantine territory who are Christian, and who are not necessarily on with this new program, and there is fighting that goes on between them. And then later on, the Muslim world gets disunified over questions of leadership, and it really happens in the year 661 that you get the beginnings of this kind of firm split. Those who believed in the leadership of this guy named Ali, and those who did not. And the Sunni Shia story becomes really important in the Middle Ages because you have to start sussing out which group of Muslims is in which place at what time. What's their ethnicity? What is their confession? What do they believe? What do they tolerate? What are they antagonistic against? And so that Sunni Shia dynamic plays out in an extraordinary number of ways. And most medievalists will tell you, if you talk about all the fighting in the Middle East, that a huge amount of the fighting was among Muslim adherents. It was between them. They're very often fighting each other, arguably fighting each other more than they ever fought someone like the Crusaders, for example. So establishing, you kind of have to start off and establish that there's those tensions, there's those things that are going to ripple and cause great change later on.
Yeah. Okay. So most of that will lead to the book. Any of those interested, it'll be in the book. There'll be a link in the show's notes to purchase the book. Okay. But we'll kind of jump, and we're going to jump in a minute kind of to the late 10th century. So, but what happens in between? We were last in Jerusalem in 630 until really the 10th century, the late 900s. What happens to Jerusalem in between those years?
You have in those years what I would argue a relatively peaceful city under Sunni Muslim rule, at least until you get to the 960s, when it's going to become 960s, 970s, when it's going to turn over to Shia rule. But even then, you have relative peace. You have Christians, Jews, and Muslims living in the city at the same time, coexisting. And the reason for this, and Muslims are very proud of this, and I think there's good reason to be proud of this, is that the story goes that when the Muslims take the city in 638, the Caliph, his name is Umar ibn Khattab, right? Umar comes into the city, and he makes a deal with the local patriarch to says, if you have Christian churches, you can retain them, right? You have Christian liberties, you can keep your property, and you can worship, and you can do whatever you want. We're just going to take the Temple Mount, and which was being used as a garbage dump at the time. We're going to clean it off, and we're going to build there. And the patriarch says, well, what about the Jews? Because we threw the Jews out. And so in the beginning, there's this document, it's called Umar's Assurance, where he assures the Christians that they keep their rights. And there's no mention of the Jews, right? But if you read the Arabic documents, they talk about how the Jews were actually let back into the city. And it seems what happened is that maybe Umar came in and said, okay, this is a situation on the ground. Fine. No Jews. I got it. And then within a couple of years, changed his mind and said, you know what, if they want to live here, that's fine. I'll collect taxes from them like everybody else. So Jews moved back in. And so really from the 640s on, Christians, Muslims, and Jews living next to each other in Jerusalem, each worshiping in different places of the city. The Jews are building synagogues. The Christians are building churches. The Muslims build their holy spots, the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque up on the Temple Mount. And you have this broad coexistence that's really only interrupted by kind of local problems, tax issues. You don't like a governor, and so there's a small riot or something like this, all usually quieted down and calmed down relatively quickly. And that goes on, the 600s, the 700s, the 800s, the 900s.
Is this generally because the Muslims are more tolerant of Judaism and Jews at the time than the Christians?
That's a great question, because this is a highly controversial. If you look around the rest of the Near East, there's a huge argument about how tolerant Muslims really were, right? Because there is this concept put out about the dhimmi and dhimmitude, and this idea of if you are not a Muslim, you're living under this harsh repressive circumstances, right? And that certainly seems to be the case in a great many places. What I found is it's not the case in Jerusalem. Not that there wasn't, clearly the Muslims are in charge. You're going to be taxed more. There's going to be tariffs that are uncomfortable. You're not going to get to live exactly where you want. There is going to be, seizures of little properties and things like that. They're in charge. But what I found is I don't want to call it an oasis of tolerance, because I think that's pushing it too far. But it seems to have been different. And I would argue it's because of the religious significance of these buildings, this idea that everyone has the ability to have a place to worship in the city, and we need to maintain that. And if that's your base, then you can only be so repressive, right? You can only shove so much. And then the economic argument is probably second. And this is what I get into when I get to the 10th century and the Shia rule. The economic importance of these Christians, and especially the Jews in the region, is it's got to be at the top of their minds. There are major revenues coming into the city because of this diverse population. So throwing them out, the Crusaders throw everyone out in the 12th century, and their economy crashes. It's a ghost town. I think that the Sunni rulers are a little smarter than that.
Okay, so now we'll jump forward. Actually, one more thing I did want to mention, and we'll discuss this more later. You did mention how it's like this: there's tolerant, and there's Jews, Muslims, and Christians. That's kind of something you argue throughout the book. This is kind of like your argument that they coexisted peacefully, besides for sporadic instances of violence. And I'm sure there is, arguments made on the other side of your argument. I'm sure there's pushback to that. So I don't know if we'll discuss that. We will dedicate some time at the end of the podcast. Spoiler alert, stay tuned. We'll discuss that. But I just wanted to mention, because you already alluded to that, that is something that is a thread running through the book. So, and you kind of mentioned this a couple times. Okay, so in the 960s, the Christians, the Byzantines returned, right? This is kind of where, as you mentioned, we had a couple centuries. Now we're middle of the 10th century, and now we're going to get kind of the seesawing back and forth again a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Byzantines, they lost a lot of land to the Muslims. They lose Egypt, which I refer to in class as the checkbook of the ancient world, right? I mean, that's where all the money is, right? From the Nile River. They lose Egypt. They lose Syria. They lose the Levant, right? They start to lose some. Eventually, the Turks are going to take half of Asia Minor away. So you're losing all of this territory and all of this revenue, and they would love to get it back. They would love to. And so inevitably, you are going to get military campaigns down there. It's interesting how long it takes to generate that, because Byzantium has its own issues going on in those centuries. But eventually you do get a couple invasions by the emperors, and they get close, but they never quite get there. They never actually get to the city. And so that doesn't mean they're not involved in the city. We know they're sending money down there. They have representatives there. Some of the governors of Jerusalem are actually writing to the Byzantine emperor. So there's a lot of connections, but militarily, they never get their hands back on it. They try a couple times. They never quite get there. They get about south to Tyre at one point. So, they're up in Lebanon, and you can kind of look and say it's not too far away, but they never get down to the actual city itself.
Right. Okay. So I guess I was wrong. They didn't go back and forth yet. We'll get to the Crusades. It just was, they were writing them letters. Right. Okay. Now, but something, a instance of violence in the city is by Caliph al-Hakim, right? If I'm pronouncing his name correct. Yeah. And that's something that is an important, so to speak, unfortunate event. Yes. When does that occur, and what occurs?
Yeah. So that's in 1009, and his name is al-Hakim, and we call him the Mad Caliph, because depending on how you look at it, he was either, well, he's a messianic figure if you're a member of the Druze. If you're not, then he is looks like a madman who, for whatever reason, sort of snaps and proceeds to eliminate members of his own advisors, the local government, and throughout these cities, takes down all of these holy spots. And so 1009, there is this sort of reckoning in Jerusalem where, under al-Hakim's command, his guys go into town and they destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they burn it to the ground. And of course, because this is the Middle Ages, can't stress enough, all these things that happen in the Middle Ages, most of them, at some point, some source is going to chime in and say it was the fault of the Jews. And it's the tenor of the literature. And this is one of them. There's this accusation that the Jews are involved. They're ratting out something Christians are doing in the church, and it's idolatry, and you need to come stop this idolatry. And that's a whole controversy. But whatever the reason, he comes in and he destroys it. And it's not just Christians that he goes after. He goes after Jews as well. He goes after Sunni Muslims. He goes after Shia. It's kind of open season on everyone. And so you get this odd period that is just horrifying. And what makes it really stick is that the news about this, it's such a shocking thing, because if it's the Sepulchre Church, this is the tomb of Jesus. This is where pilgrims go visit. And now to hear it's been destroyed, right? That news cascades back to Western Europe, and it starts popping up in these Western sources, and you get this outrage back in the West, and you get these demands of, we need to do something about this. Someone needs to go to Jerusalem and set this right. This is where some scholars chime in and say they want to see the beginnings of the Crusades in this event, because they want to say, well, is that like the first moment where Christians said, we need to go to Jerusalem, and with a military force? And there's an argument about whether it's that or something else sparked the Crusades, but it certainly got that kind of importance. Everyone is upset about this. Al-Hakim the Mad. He ends up wandering in the desert and disappearing. And nobody really knows. They find a cloak later on with a bunch of stab holes in it and blood. But again, it depends on your persuasion. As I said, if you're Druze, then he disappeared, and he will return. If you're not, then he was murdered, probably by one of the people he offended in his killings. We would guess.
And again, going back to that argument that I mentioned and that you kind of alluded to, you view this more as kind of an outlier than as more of the standard of what was going on there.
Yeah, and that's where I think people who are really going to disagree with the book, that's going to be their bone to pick. We tend to look back at Jerusalem at these horrific, shocking things, and what happened in 1009 was horrific and shocking. I mean, you're talking about thousands of people dead, mass destruction of holy sites. all kinds of upheaval. My argument is, yes, you do have some of these, but across 700 years, you don't actually have that many of them. We just are drawn to them because they're so well known and they're notorious, they're infamous, whatever word you want to use. But in total count, there's really not that many. And I try to stress, 700 years is a long, long time. And if you say, okay, well, there were, 4 or 5 of these climactic events over the course of 700 years. Well, okay, I got it. It's not good, but wow. I mean, there are some cities like Damascus, or if you look at Baghdad, where Damascus is the one that's most prominent in my mind. I mean, you were talking about sieges multiple times within everyone's lifetime, right? Somebody needs to write a book on Damascus and the attacks on it. I think he would run out of paper, right? I mean, it gets attacked all the time. Baghdad constantly has violence. I mean, it's very dangerous places. And I say, well, yeah, these moments in time, Jerusalem was very dangerous, but most of the time, it really wasn't. And so there's one review that came in and they're like, and that was the point they made. They said, how can you ignore these big climactic events? And my point is, I'm not ignoring them. I'm just saying that they were episodic. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm sure we'll get back to more of that later on. Okay. So another thing, until we get to the First Crusade, just jumping around, and the book does, I'll just talk about the book for a minute here. The book does jump around, but the book also does delve a little bit on some of these topics, even more than a little bit in depth. And we're going here. This is just a podcast. Okay. So in the 11th century, how is the Jews there? I know you discuss a little bit in the book, some strife and tension between Karaite Jews and regular rabbinic Jews. And you also mentioned the Geonim, the head of the yeshiva, in there. I don't know if you want to mention this. This is something you do discuss a bit.
Yeah. So you've got this this fantastic treasure trove, really, of documents called the Genitza texts that are unearthed in Cairo, and now they sit at Cambridge, and just thousands of these letters that are written back and forth between Jewish communities, and it really gives you an excellent window into what that community was like, not only in Jerusalem, but in Caesarea and Tyre and Cairo and these other places. They're writing back and forth to each other with concerns and, hey, I'm broke. Could you lend me some money? Or I got myself in some legal trouble. Could you help me out? Or I'm going to move over to Cairo. Do have a place I can stay? Really the nuts and bolts of social and cultural life. And you can read these things, and it seems like there is a pretty vital Jewish presence in the holy city. And what I mean by that is, it's not just, I don't see Jews just kind of sitting there, kind of heads down, right? With the Muslim governor looking over their shoulder, but engaging in public debate and having different schools of thought and having a yeshiva and being able to talk about these things pretty publicly without being persecuted. And I find that remarkable. And it happens at the same time that the same thing is happening with the Muslim community as well. They're starting to build schools, and they build a law school, right? And so everybody's talking, everybody's getting along. But then there are all these controversies that pop up that I think, in the scope of Near Eastern history, are kind of small ball type stuff, right? I mean, you have a local who's in charge of the community in Old Fustat. Well, it's this one guy, but this other guy's claiming to. Okay, and so they're having this kind of argument in this fight. It's the stuff that never makes it into big survey books. But what it shows is that there's active dialogue and travel going back and forth constantly, and it's quite remarkable. The problem is that there are some tensions, and there are some regional changes that are going on. Life can be tough in these places. I mean, these Genitza documents talk about how there is some oppression of Jews and of Christians as well, where you just don't get to do everything you want to do. There's a lot of suspicion, people getting arrested on the say-so. So I saw somebody doing this, got to bring them before the judge, right? And so you've got that kind of stuff. I mentioned, there's various parts, there's sometimes anti-Jewish things that come out, particularly on the taxation. You see that a lot. Levying the taxes, because the Jewish communities in the Near East, their commercial context, because they have such history in the place, heavy commercial dealings. And so it's attractive. You want to tax it. You want that money for yourself. And so several of these letters say, geez, they jacked up the taxes to us. What's remarkable is when the taxes go up, the Jews petition the Muslim governor of Jerusalem. And if that doesn't work, they petition the Caliph in Cairo. And sometimes he gives them relief, which to me was absolutely amazing. Every time I read one of these, this is unbelievable. They write and they say, look, our taxes are a little too high. And the Shia Caliph in Cairo says, you know what? I agree. My governor's doing a bad job. I'm going to tell him to lower your taxes, give you a little bit of relief. Wow. I mean, that's so I see a lot of that kind of stuff going on. The problem is that there are some moments where things get a little dicey in terms of what's going on in the region, if the oppression is too much. And then there are other cities in the region that frankly are more attractive in many ways. I mean, I love Jerusalem. It's such a vibrant, huge place, right? But in the Middle Ages, it never numbered more than 30,000 people. It's small. It's off the trade routes, right? You could live there, or you could live in Tyre, or you could live in Cairo, which is this like brand new city that the Fatimids built. It's this glorious thing where you can go see the cosmopolitan wonderfulness of Baghdad. And so in time, a lot of the Jewish scholars leave, and a lot of the Muslim scholars leave. They go along with them. And I think I tell the story of one where the head of the Muslim law school actually goes to the head of the yeshiva and says, "Hey, I'm packing up. I'm going to go up here. You should come with me, man. Because this is a better city." And they're like, "Okay, we'll go together." Which I just started laughing. I'm like, these are the stories you never hear. It's always they're killing each other, they hate each other, religious violence, and here they are. They're friends and they're looking out for each other.
Yeah, which is, important to tell. I guess, we could get it back again. The pushback could be, okay, true, but, still, what was really going on or what was important or whatever. I'm just pointing out until you said that.
Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. Okay. So, and it's because Jerusalem is really the holy city, right? And that's, to Jews, and then, they have the Christians, the Muslims, and that's what's kind of going on. Like you said, even though it's kind of the other cities are bigger and grander. Okay. Now the Turks show up. The Turks come on the scene. Now we're with the Turks. If you want to mention the Turks, not the Ottoman Turks, right? Just the Ottomans are going to be later. The Turks, yes. And then we're going to get to the Crusades, and kind of the Turks, kind of, as you put it in the book, I think, kind of somewhat maybe set the stage for the Crusades, right?
Yeah, arguably, and Crusade historians agree on nothing. But one of the traditional explanations is that it's the Turkish onslaught that really changes things, right? They beat the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert, and that's kind of like this major breaking point in 1081 that ushers in the Western interest. But before that, they come to Jerusalem. These so-called Seljuk Turks, they dominate the Levant. They take control of the Holy City, and when they do, which probably happened in 1073. So this is 26 years before the First Crusade arrives in Jerusalem. In 1073, they arrive there, and it seems to be pretty peaceful. They blockade the city, which is kind of the first thing you do when you want a town. You just line up your soldiers outside, and then you put the news to them and say, well, you can surrender and you'll be fine, or you can hold out and starve to death, and the city just surrenders. And so the Sunnis take control of the city in kind of a bloodless enterprise. Doesn't seem to be any kind of recriminations when they get in there. It's not like they persecute the Shia. It's not like they persecute the Jews or the Christians that are there. And you still have this diverse population. Just kind of take control of it. The only violence that happens is when some of the Shia take possession of the one of the warlords' families. They throw him in a jail cell. And so this guy Atsiz, he comes back in 1077, and there's a bloodletting of the garrison. He just wipes it out. But again, I argue, I think he's mostly killing Shia. I don't think he has a grudge against the other faiths. He's mad that somebody threw his wife in jail. I would be pretty mad too, I suppose. And so you've got this Turkish control of the city. And you've got kind of this flip-flop that goes on, Shia, to Sunni, and eventually back to Shia. And in all of that, you have to leave it up to interpretation as to what's going on there, right? The local chronicles are talking about these things that are happening, and yeah, there's some issues, there's some strife, and this happened, and that was unfortunate, whatnot. But the view in the West is very, very different. If you read exclusively Latin chronicles being produced over in England and France and the whole in the Roman Empire, you would think this is a city that is dominated by Muslims. They're systematically oppressing and killing everyone, disemboweling Christians, subjecting them to horrible things, and you have to go over and you have to save the city. And the reality is well, you've got a different owner, but life kind of continues the way it had before.
Okay, so that's kind of, as you said, what was going on in Jerusalem and what the Christians in Western Europe thought was going on in Jerusalem.
Right.
So then we get to the First Crusade. You mentioned a bunch of Crusade historians. There's a lot of literature, a lot been written and research on the Crusades. This is not a Crusade podcast, although Jerusalem is very relevant to the Crusades, of course.
Right.
It's what they were headed out to. So let's just give a brief, description, summation, synopsis, whatever, of the Crusade, of the First Crusade specifically, and how it pertains, how it relates to Jerusalem.
Okay. So the reasons why the Crusade launched, there's at least a dozen reasons, and my argument is that they're all right and they're all wrong. Nobody can really agree on what the prime mover was. One of them is I mentioned earlier the Battle of Manzikert. I think I gave you the wrong date. It's not 1081, it's 1071. The idea that the Turks are moving on Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire reaches out to Rome and asks for help. Right. That's kind of the traditional standard thing. And then the Pope goes to Clermont in 1095 and gives this impassioned address. Our fellow Christians are asking for help. We have to go save them. Right. There's been huge pushback against that. There's lots of other aspects to why the Crusade set off. There's apocalypticism. There's anti-Judaism. There is the economic factor. There's a whole host of them. And I think they all have a little bit of resonance of truth. But for whatever reason, you get this massive army that is created in the West and sets out in 1096 to retake the Holy City from Muslim control. And there's two main waves of it. The first one is called the so-called Peasants' Crusade, or people call it now the People's Crusade because peasant is seen as sort of pejorative. It's this wave of farmers who are really unequipped to do anything. They're led by a group of nobles and men with fighting experience, but they go to Constantinople, they enter Asia Minor, and they're wiped out. Right. The first wave is a disaster. And then the second major wave comes, the so-called Princes' Crusade, led by multiple princes from around Europe. And that one succeeds. That one cuts through Asia Minor, retakes the city of Antioch, crawls down the Levantine coastline, retakes several cities, some by deals, some with massacres, and then ends up at Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. And that begins the great siege of Jerusalem in 1099 that culminates with the Crusaders moving into the city and conducting this massacre that is well known. I call it the original sin of the Crusades because it is probably the best known event of the entire crusading period, the sack of 1099.
Okay, but before we get to, just want to clarify one thing. You mentioned they went through Asia Minor. If you could explain to the listeners what Asia Minor, where Asia Minor was.
Sorry. Modern day Turkey, right? So they start in Constantinople, modern day Istanbul. They cross over and into Asia and then carve their way through the mountains. They go to Nicaea and they help liberate that with Byzantine troops. And then they fight some battles in the mountains. And then they emerge in Antioch, which today is in Turkey, very southern bit right before you get into Lebanon. And so once they pass Antioch, in emerging from it in 1099, then it's straight down the coast through modern day Lebanon and Israel.
Okay, I will mention once we're talking about the beginning of the Crusades. For those interested, I have a podcast with Professor Ephraim Kannervogel on the killing of the Jews when they in Germany.
The Rhineland massacres. Yeah.
Yes, the Rhineland massacres. That happened. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously that's a big part of the Crusades. Also, unfortunately, what went on in Europe, the killing of the Jews.
Huge part of it, and that's why it's you start talking about motivations for these things, right? Count Amico, who's leading this, right? I mean, he is. We have his purported words where he's saying, if we're going after the enemies of Christ, let's start with the ones who live right next door. I mean, it is deliberate, targeted massacres of these Jewish populations, and that's why you can't take that out. You say, well, you can't say it's just to defend Byzantium because you've got leaders of the Crusades saying we're here to kill Jews. Absolutely crucial part of it. It gets off to such a horrific start. It's not a surprise that it ends in horror as well.
Okay, so they show up at Jerusalem, and what happens then?
So they break through the walls. Well, they don't break through the walls. They overtop one of the walls with a siege tower, and then they come in through the Zion Gate in the south as well. So they're coming from the north and they're coming from the south, and they're pouring through. As they come in, they are pushing the defenders into the streets. and the defenders are fighting what we would call a delaying action. So if you imagine the citizens are kind of behind them running for the Temple Mount because it's fortified, it's elevated terrain, it's safer. And the garrison is fighting a delay as the Crusaders are pushing forward, and they're backing up towards the Mount. In time, you get this population of probably about 3,000 people packed onto the Temple Mount. It's great because that's fortified, but the downside is if it's breached, now you're trapped. You have nowhere to go because you can't climb over the walls. The drop into the Kidron Valley is just massive. So they get massacred on the Temple Mount. Now, before that, in the north, in the Jewish district of the town, the Juvari, as it was called, which is today the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, but in the 11th century, it's where the Jews are living. We know that the Jews are on the wall. They're actually actively defending the city because they don't want these guys in their town. They have heard what these Crusaders have done everywhere else they've gone. They know their reputation, and they don't want this, right? So many of those Jews die fighting on the walls, and the rest run. Some of them run to synagogue, which is then burned down. And the allegation is it's burned down with Jews inside of it. So you've got this one small massacre of Jews here, and then the rest of the group is pushed in the Temple Mount, and they're eliminated there. And the guess is that most of the people on the Temple Mount, it's just a guess, they're probably Muslims, most of them. There's a group of 300 that managed to escape. They climb up onto the roof of Al-Aqsa Mosque. And nighttime is falling, and they climb up there. And the next day, they're promised safe conduct by the Crusaders. Theoretically, the bloodlust is supposed to be died down now, and they say, "Oh no, you can come down. We'll let you go." And they kill them instead. So the safe conduct is violated. So you have this killing that goes on. The big question is, so day one is breaking into the city and this massacre, right? Day two is the killing of these 300 people on the roof of the mosque. The question is what happened on day three, because there is one Western source that claims that on day three, the army then systematically went through the city and basically killed everyone else. Which, if true, the number he gives is 10,000. And there's an argument about this because there are some Hebrew documents that seem to allude to this, but then there's Arabic documents that don't make any mention of it. So it's become this kind of controversial thing. Was there a third day massacre or not? I take a pass on it on the book and say, well, maybe not. I don't really know, but whatever it is, those days 1 and 2, for sure, you have over 3,000 people being cut down in the city.
Now, I don't know if we mentioned this. How many Christians, how many people go on this crusade when they leave, and how many end up showing up at Jerusalem?
So they start, the number could be anywhere between 70 and 90,000. It's a fair number of people. Now, how many of those are soldiers? How many of those are camp followers? That sort of thing is a good question. But by the time they get to Jerusalem, there's about 14,000 left. You've lost an awful lot. Yeah,
exactly. And you mentioned a couple of numbers there. So how many are killed in Jerusalem, and then what happens in the aftermath? I think you mentioned this much earlier. So they throw everybody out, Muslims, Jews, no one's allowed in the city besides Christians?
Yeah, and again, that's also controversial because there are indications that some of the Muslims were maybe kept as slaves. And then the Hebrew documents I referred to, there's these other Genitza texts that seem to indicate that many of the Jews were kept as hostages and that they were later ransomed to relatives in Egypt and in Ascalon. So there seem to be a lot who survive. But what we don't know is if they survive the immediacy of it, are they then sold into slavery? Are they killed later on? It's hard to know. What we do know is that at some point, there is a law that is passed that forbids Jews and Muslims from entering Jerusalem. They can't come in. At first, they're not even trading with them. Eventually, that'll be relaxed, and you can come in and trade if you pay a tax, pay a tariff on the way in and out. But in the beginning, it's Christian only city. They establish essentially a theocracy. There will be a secular leader of it, but it's pretty clear it's a Christian city now, run by Christian law, and so none of these others are welcome. And as I mentioned, it's a ghost town because what happens is after the crusade is over, most of these people go home. right? I mean, they've been gone for years from their house. They're from northern France, or they're from the Low Countries, or they go home, and there's a skeleton force left in the Holy Land, and you've got about 3,000 soldiers, we think, and they have to defend a piece of territory that is 350 miles north to south, 150 miles at its greatest extent east to west, roughly speaking. It's Edessa, Antioch, Lebanon, modern day Israel. They have to defend that with only 3,000 people. So there's not even that many Christians in Jerusalem. It is a ghost town. There's no Jews. There's no Muslims. There's barely any Christians. There's no market going. There's no building activity because there's no money, right? And it's odd. It's like, okay, well, you have a hollowed out city. Congratulations. Now what? What do you do with it? It's basically worthless. Except from a religious point of view, they're very happy they have their church back. And that's they would say, well, yeah, it's true. We have no money, but we have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that's what we came for.
Okay, so to kind of conclude this, end of this first crusade over here, before we move on to Saladin the Merciful, as he's known as, this is kind of to go back to that theme that we mentioned running through the book, though, to ask you this. So this is kind of the second, really bloody, terrible incident going on in Jerusalem within within 1 century. Al-Hakim, and then you have this, and there are some other small ones. So again, you're arguing, oh no, this is just kind of an outlier.
Not an outlier. I wouldn't say an outlier. I would say it's exceptional. One of the arguments I make is that if you look at that siege we started with in 614, I'm kind of making the argument that was the end of an epoch. That was the end of kind of the classical era where you would go into a city and you would massacre all the defenders, because everything that happens after that, when the Muslims take it in 638, there's no massacre, right? When the Shia take it in the 970s, there's no massacre. When the Sunnis take it back from the Shia in the 1070s, there's no massacre. The only one that happens is when, as I mentioned, they grab this guy's wife and family and throw it in a prison, and so he takes revenge against the garrison. But I see that as just something very, very different and very personal, right? When the Fatimids, the Shia, retake the city in 1098, right before the Crusaders get there, there's no massacre. And even if you look at later Christian retakings of the city, right, that go on, you look at Saladin, you look at Frederick II, these other moments, no massacres, right? So my argument is like, okay, so you start off with a bang with the Persians, got it. And that really has nothing to do with religion per se, right? That means that you really only have what Al-Hakim was doing for whatever reason he was doing it, and the massacre of the First Crusade. Those are the big two bloody, I think, really significant events in terms of inter-religious fighting, right? After that, it's blockades, it's surrenders, it's peaceful transfers, until you get to the year 1244, and then you get the third kind of big one in a military context. So yes, I would say they're exceptional because they go against the norm. The norm is peace, living together, not liking each other, possibly hating each other, but living next door to each other. That's the norm. And these things are so shocking because they go so much against them.
Okay, so now they have this establishment of the so-called Kingdom of Jerusalem, right? I believe that's what it was, that they have a king and everything that's established. Okay, but let's discuss Saladin the Merciful. So you kind of in the book go pretty in-depth. I don't know how in-depth we'll go here. Was he really merciful or not? But he may as well discuss it. Why was he called merciful? Was he a merciful person? And what is his role to play in the Jerusalem story of the Middle Ages?
Yeah, so he gets lauded, and it's not just by medieval historians, but by everyone. I mean, I would bring that all the way up to Jimmy Carter, who in the 1970s gave a talk praising him, saying, Sadat had a chance to be another Saladin, right? These sorts of things. He has been loved and reinvented by so many different generations as a chivalric knight, as a great guy, as a justice bringer, and because the idea is we have these biographers for Saladin who are very close to him, who are recording what he's thinking, right? And when he takes Jerusalem, some people are urging him, it's time to get revenge for 1099, right? You know what the Christians did to the Muslims in 1099. Now it's time for payback, right? Put them to the sword. And Saladin famously says, no, I'm not going to kill them. I'm going to show them the mercy that they did not show because we're better than that. Right. And so he gets this reputation as someone who could have carried out a massacre, but he's got this justice in his, he's not going to do it. It's not going to be eye for an eye. He's going to be merciful. And I challenge that a little bit in the book with some of the other things he decides to do with these people. he's not killing them, but he may have allowed a mass rape of all the women, which you can then get into an argument about. That sounds pretty bad too.
Okay, so I think then we can kind of jump ahead to the Third Crusade. You mentioned much earlier, Richard the Lionheart. The listeners may be familiar, but you could mention him, discuss him a little bit, and how that plays in. What happened with the Third Crusade?
Yeah, so the Third Crusade is off to save Jerusalem. When it was called, Jerusalem hadn't even technically fallen yet. It was called after the Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, when Saladin destroyed the kingdom's army in one fell swoop. And the presumption was, well, our army's gone. The city's toast. There's no way we can hold Jerusalem without an army. So Saladin's going to get Jerusalem back. So we launched this crusade to retake the holy city because we presume we're going to have to retake it. And so you have all these different contingents going. They all flow ultimately to the city of Acre, which is put under siege for nearly 2 years. And there's a lot of intense fighting there and a lot of death. I calculate at least 35,000 soldiers died just at the siege of Acre. And when it's over, some crusaders have had enough. Some, simply no longer exist. And one, most infamously, the King of France, Philip Augustus, considers his holy obligation fulfilled, and he goes back to France. He says, well, I helped you get back Acre. Good luck with the rest, Richard. I'm going back to France. And from that, you get all the, for any of your listeners who've, if you know the Robin Hood stories, Prince John is back in England conspiring while Richard's on crusade, and he's conspiring with the King of France, right? So by the time Richard emerges from Acre, he has a small force, which can be very effective, and he meets Saladin in battle and actually beats him at a couple points. But it does not have the combat power to actually march through the mountains to Jerusalem and sustain itself. Even today, and this is what I tell my students, I'm like, you've got to drive the highway from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem. What is it, 44, 45 kilometers, right? And as it cuts through the mountains, you just say, this is your one way in and out. How do you protect your line of supply? And the answer is you can't. Saladin has an army and he can just snip it off. All he has to do is march right behind you and you're cut off from the sea. And so Richard knows he can't take the city. And so instead of doing it, he agrees to a truce with Saladin. They hammer out an agreement. Saladin keeps Jerusalem. Richard keeps what he's conquered. And some Christians get to go to Jerusalem and pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they get to do a tour around and whatnot. But then he leaves. He goes home. And that sparks a lot of debate because you can ask the question, well, was the Third Crusade a failure? If the object was to retake Jerusalem, it didn't. If the object was to retake parts of the kingdom, it did. It retakes Acre. It grabs big pieces of territory and kind of gives the Christians some land to operate on again. So there's an argument over how great a crusading king Richard the Lionheart was. He didn't decisively beat Saladin. He didn't recapture the holy city. So I tend to look at him as kind of a failure. But I know there are British nationalists out there who would be like, that's one of our greatest kings. How dare you say that about Richard?
Yeah, and he famously, when he was, I think his coronation, there was a major pogroms. A lot of Jews were killed in England. So we should mention the anti-Semitism and the killing of the Jews. What happened under Richard the Lionheart? That's very important.
Absolutely. And because there's a story. Some of these Jews try to get into the coronation feast, and somebody says, "Wait a minute, you don't belong here." And then there's a killing in London, and then it like sparks these other killings around England. I should mention there's a in York, England, there was the biggest massacre was at the spot it's called Clifford's Tower now in York. They've just redone the tower, and from what I haven't been there yet, but when I understand they have a really nice memorial up there now. Because it used to be you go in and you see the walls, and you're like, well, what happened here? Somebody had to know to tell you the story, and now they're doing a much better job of telling that story. So again, and you can see a pattern, right? Wait a minute. Do crusades need to start off with this anti-Jewish violence? Because the First Crusade does, the Third Crusade does, kind of becoming maybe a worrying trend. Richard's one of those guys where he's famous because of Robin Hood. He's this great crusader king. You start to peel back the surface a little bit and see what he's involved in. He didn't order those Jewish killings in England. There's no evidence that he said, go and get them, but they certainly occurred. And there was very lackluster restraining of these forces. And so it raises a number of questions.
Okay, now getting back to, I want to just discuss the kingdom of Jerusalem and what's going on in the area. So Jews and Muslims during this time period, these centuries, the 12th century, the 13th century. Are there Jews going back? Are there Jews there coming there? Are there Muslims there? What's going on other than Christians?
Yeah, and this is what I found really fascinating, given what I've been talking about in terms of people living next to each other and getting along, right? Because what I learned going through just reading the basic textbooks is, well, the city's populated of Jews, depopulated of Jews and Muslims, right? It's a Christian-only place, and then eventually they find their way back in. What I found is they're coming back in a lot earlier than most people recognize. By the 11 teens, so 19 years after the First Crusade, Muslims are back in the city. It's very clear they're back in. They're trading. At one point, the taxes against them are actually lowered because you want to facilitate the travel and goods and services. And what I found most shocking to me was by 1140 at the latest, you have Muslims praying on the Temple Mount. You have them actually praying outside Al-Aqsa Mosque with the permission of the resident Christians, in particular the Knights Templar, who are supposed to be these the worst militant Christians of them all, right? You have Muslims praying on the Temple Mount, and you have a lot of this kind of prayerful activity, not just elite Muslims, but groups of them, right? The Jews are a little bit more inscrutable. We have this very famous rabbi, Benjamin of Tudela, who has this journey, has this wonderful book as he goes through, and he does this job where he counts Jewish families wherever he goes. And in Jerusalem, he counts only 4 families. And that is in the 1160s, I believe. So 4, you say, wow, that's not that many. Okay, maybe the families are a little large, but you're talking about a very small population. But they're there, and grows a little steadily from that point on. Saladin relaxed the restrictions against Jews, and what we understand is that many more Jews moved back to the city after he takes it in 1187. So there are Christians, Muslims, and Jews living next to each other. I would wager there's many more Muslims there than Jews. The Jewish population is small, and it will remain small for a long time because, frankly, the Jews in the region have options. One of the interesting things is after that First Crusade, you have this harsh treatment of Jews in Jerusalem and all these prohibitions, right? You don't have those in the other towns of the Levant. You just don't have it. The historian Joshua Prower, who did a lot of the foundational research on this stuff, he said, look, if you look at Caesarea and you look at Tyre and you look at Ascalon, you look at all these regions around Galilee, you find absent Jewish communities thriving. They're doing fine. There's no prohibition. It was just in the Holy City. Because it was considered like this is the city of Jesus and no one else can be here. But what I find is that unfreezes faster than I certainly thought it did. I don't want to go and say, well, it became any kind of wonderland of people, living in harmony, but they're there. They're clearly there. And then the other piece of it, and this is what some modern Muslims very much disagree with. That's where in that period is where we get the first really solid indications of devotions at the Western Wall. In those years, right? Not praying on the Temple Mount, on the Mount of Olives, looking at the city, but rather down along the wall. So clearly you've got some communities living there, and then visitors, people like Maimonides who are coming in and visiting and praying there. So there's something going on. I just wish we had better demographic information. All we know is what Benjamin tells us, and it's not much. It's not much.
Okay, now the city itself, I don't know if we made this clear, so we should emphasize this. Who was in control at this time? You had the Kingdom of Jerusalem, we mentioned Saladin, Richard. What's going on as we'll get to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. But until then, what's going on with Jerusalem? Just to clarify this, was it flip-flopping? Who was in charge of the city itself?
So the city itself is under the rule of the Kingdom of Jerusalem until 1187, right? So the King of Jerusalem, that is his capital. That is where he rules from. Once Saladin takes the city, that capital moves to Acre when it's liberated. That will become the new seat of the Kingdom of Jerusalem until the city returns to Christian hands in 1229 with Emperor Frederick II. And then once again, you would think that the King of Jerusalem would rule there. But the funny thing about Frederick is he takes that title for himself. He crowns himself King of Jerusalem and then leaves. So it's technically his city as the king, but he doesn't want anything to do with it he really wants to spend his time in Sicily and southern Italy with his other business. So you've got a king who is literally across the water in 1229.
So who is Frederick II? Where is he from? You mentioned, Italy, but where is Sicily? Where is he from? What's his story? How does he get involved in the story?
Yeah, so he's from the imperial house, the Hohenstaufen or the Staufen family in Germany. We would call it Germany today. It wasn't Germany. There was the land of the empire. As people call it, the Holy Roman Empire. He is a guy who has territory in what we would call Germany and northern Italy, and has pretensions down in Sicily and southern Italy. And those moves, he's not the first German emperor to want to control southern Italy and Sicily, but those moves bring him in direct conflict with the papal seat in Rome, who are not too keen on being surrounded by Germans in the north and in the south. And so he gets himself in an awful lot of trouble with the popes of his day, ends up getting excommunicated several times. He hardly cuts the figure of a righteous crusader, right? I mean, when he goes on his crusade, he's actually an excommunicate. He's been cast out, separated from the flock of Christ. His interest is to claim Jerusalem for himself with arguably as little effort as possible. And so he brings a small force to the Levant in what we call the Sixth Crusade, and makes a move on the city and ends up winning the city with a deal. He doesn't have to fight for it. He simply meets with the Sultan of Egypt and cuts a deal.
So what's that deal? How does he make a deal with just a small force? And what is his deal?
So this is the deal, and this deal is remarkable. And this is where I say there really is a connection between the medieval world and what's going on in Jerusalem today, right? The deal is that Frederick gets to be the king of Jerusalem. He gets the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Christians get the city. The city proper belongs to them, right? The Muslims, in exchange, get the exclusive right to pray on the Temple Mount. They are the only ones who are allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. There's a story about Frederick actually being up on the Temple Mount, and a priest comes up and he's reading passages from the Bible, and Frederick throws him, expels him from the mount and says, "I'll burn your Bible if there's any more of this crap." So this area is for Muslims only. It is that the agreement that really does endure all the way to the present day, with only a couple hiccups, and they're medieval hiccups. The rest of it is pretty much a line of succession all the way up until, as I talk in the book, 1967 and Moish Dayan, and we're going to keep the status quo, and that sort of thing. That's how he gets it. He cuts this deal, and then he agrees to other things, like, he's going to disarm some of these fortresses, and it's supposed to be a 10-year truce, right? So I've brought peace to the land. I've secured the holy city. We have Jerusalem back. We don't have the Temple Mount, but as Christians, do we really care? We don't have the Temple Mount. I mean, we've got, the Dome of the Rock. It had been converted at one point into a church. That Al-Aqsa Mosque had been the headquarters of the Knights Templar. But really, we don't really care as much about those sites. It's the Sepulchre Church that we really care about. So we get the city down below. Muslims get the city up above. And that's a deal for 10 years. And then he walks away thinking he's triumphed. But in reality, Muslims are upset because they're upset at the Sultan of Egypt because he gave away the city, right? For the right to pray. That's great, but we can't pray anywhere else in the city. They're mad at him. The Christians are furious with Frederick, absolutely furious. He's accused of all kinds of anti-Muslim sympathies. He had a Muslim bodyguard. He writes personal letters to Al-Kamil in Egypt. So the accusation is, you're buddy with the Saracens. We know where you're coming from. And so, so here comes the condemnation from the popes. And I look at it, I say, what's a very interesting deal by two world leaders who go apparently into a room by themselves, and they do a compromise. But nobody is satisfied with it. And when Frederick leaves the Holy Land, I've got this story of where he sails away from Acre, and the butchers are throwing pieces of meat at him because they're so mad about what he's done. But it does set a standard where, okay, Christians down below, Muslims up top. And then you've got to answer the question, okay, well, if that's the arrangement, where are the Jews? Right? Because, one's up here, one's down there. And what it looks like from the documents is that they're still there praying at the Western Wall. but they are living in more constrained circumstances because now once again they are under Christian rule. They're not under Muslim rule anymore, and so it's not freedom for them. It's still highly restricted living. But that deal does not mention them. It doesn't concern them. They're not political players, and so they don't have a role in those negotiations.
We're over an hour into the podcast, and the first time we mentioned Saracens. Do you want to just explain that to the listeners?
Yeah, that's the sources use this word, right? It's a pejorative for Muslim residents in the Levant. We would say today you wouldn't ever call Muslims this. It's a derogatory term, right? But that's the one that's kind of picked up, and all the Crusader sources use it, right? And the sources are they're a trip to read because everybody's insulting everybody on every page. Everyone's an infidel. Everyone's the handmaiden of the devil. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Always fighting against the true champions of God. It just depends on what language you're reading it in.
Okay, we'll get back in a second after Frederick leaves. But we just skipped around. I want to mention we didn't discuss the popes. We didn't discuss there was a Jewish aliyah at one point to be honest, a kind of Lunel and some others, right? They did go up. There were Jews going up. So there were different things going on at this point. I'm trying to throw them in. The book does talk about all this and much, much more. Okay, so then Frederick leaves, and as you mentioned, they're throwing stuff at him. What happens after he just abandons Israel?
Right. So what you do is if you're Muslim, you just wait for the 10 years to finish, right? One thing I didn't mention is that in an earlier crusade, the Fifth Crusade, the Ayyubid rulers of the region, this is the family that rules out of Egypt, and you have Ayyubids in the Levant, you have Ayyubids in Egypt, some ruling out of Damascus, some out of Cairo. They just actually destroy the walls of Jerusalem in the 12 teens, on the logic that if there's no walls, the city's indefensible. And so that'll maybe it won't be a magnet for Christians anymore, right? So when Frederick gets the city, there's actually no walls there. They've been demolished. There's a little bit of rebuilding of the walls, but not nearly enough. So when that 10 years is up, all you really have to do is walk back into the city, right? It's not very difficult to reclaim the city. Now there will be minor crusades sent to try to grab it back. And there's a little bit of ping-ponging back and forth in the years after Frederick. They're the so-called Barons Crusades, where a Frenchman and an Englishman go and they make this deal to temporarily grab Jerusalem back. But the fact is it's indefensible and you can't really hold it. So when the Christians do get it back, they'll hold it until the year 1244. But it's going to be taken again by this new zealous group called the Khwarezmians, who are hired on. They're kind of hired mercenaries. They'll come and they'll sack the city again, and they'll take down the walls, and it becomes a catastrophe. So after Frederick, you do have some temporary Christian control of the city, but everyone knows it's temporary. You can't keep this thing going forever. You don't have the protection you need. You're surrounded by enemies, and Europe, frankly, by this period, is starting to lose interest in the Crusades. As a movement, it is going down. The armies are getting smaller and smaller, and none of them are, when they do get launched, none of them succeed.
So a couple of things. What is the end of the Kingdom of Jerusalem? Kind of two questions. What's the end of Christian control of Jerusalem, the city, and what's the end of the Kingdom of Jerusalem?
Yeah. So 1244 is the end of Christian control of Jerusalem. That's it. In that year that the Muslims take the city, it is gone. They do attempt to form an alliance with the Ayyubids to fight against these Muslim zealots to maybe get it back someday. But they get defeated in battle, and so they never get a chance to return it. So 1244 is the hard end date for it. You will not have Christian any kind of real Christian governance of Jerusalem until Allenby comes. It takes that long when he walks in the 19 teens. It's strict Muslim control all the way until then. So 1244 is the end date, and then the end of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It takes a little bit longer, because you do have Acre, you do have these other fortresses and cities, and there will be a lot of wars that go on between the kingdom's last defenders and then a new power that rises in Egypt known as the Mamluks. And the Mamluks, these are the guys who They beat off the Crusaders. They defeat the Mongols. They're really, really great fighters. And they end up taking Acre, which is the last city on the Levantine coast in 1291. So 1291 is traditionally seen as kind of the end of the crusading period. It's not really over because the Christians are still in Cyprus. They're in Rhodes. They're in other places in the Mediterranean, but they're no longer in the Levant. So 1291 is like the end of the primary age of the Crusades.
Okay, now hopping back to Jerusalem. Yeah, now going back to Jerusalem itself. So when does your book end with who is in control of Jerusalem? And then just kind of, if you want to just mention, even after the book, until the Ottomans take control of it, which is a little later, you don't go until there, right?
Yeah, I don't go into that. I kind of stop where the Mamluks are. The Mamluks are going to grab it, right? It gets into this really this almost dizzying array of Muslim alliances as these different factions are getting with each other and trying to grab it and keep hold over it. There are crusades that are launched to get it back, but as I mentioned, they all failed. The King Louis IX, Saint Louis of France, leads the 7th and 8th crusade. And on the first one, he gets captured. On the second one, he dies, and they never get close to Jerusalem. So it ends up in the Mamluk hands. When I kind of end my story in the really at the close of the 13th century, and so you end up with this this kind of strange town that had been so important in so many ways, but it really is a shell of its former self. I think I've got the demographics that we have from one account that says that basically in 1260 there were essentially 2,000 people living there, right? It's like 1,700 Muslims, 300 Christians, no Jews to be found because they got smart and they got out of town when the Mongols showed up on the horizon, said it's too dangerous here. So they all left. But then Nachmanides shows up and starts rebuilding a synagogue and they start returning. Right. And so you get these ebbs and flows, but when you're talking late 13th century, it is tiny. When you 2,000, 3,000 people, right? You can imagine the vacancies in the city, right? The destruction. You look around and just say, it doesn't even look like much. Is this somewhere where I really want to live? But I think by then the difference is that you might look at it and say, this does not look appetizing. But by then you have established prayer at the Western Wall. So there's a reason to go back. There's a reason to bring back communities, right? You also have the established devotions on the Temple Mount. So the Muslims have a reason to be there, right? And Christians have a reason to go on pilgrimage because the Church of the Sepulchre is still there, right? So as long as those holy spots remain, you're always going to have interest in the city. But it's amazing in the medieval period just how it's almost like a sine wave. I mean, it just dips and it grows, and then something happens, and then people run away. And so at the end of my period, it looks kind of sad and pathetic. But you know, on the horizon are better things because as you mentioned, I don't really get into the Ottomans in this book. But one of the fascinating things about the Ottomans is, particularly in regards to the local Jews, is that they recognize from very early on that the Jews do have a history in the city, and they start granting them rights. And they start granting them real estate rights and permissions for worship at the wall, for residents. And they really do cement that and say, you have an actual right to be here. You don't have to conquer it to be here. You can pray as you like in these locations. And that kind of gets back to the theme of the book, right? Whenever I see Muslim rulers over Jerusalem, I see them granting tolerances to Jews, right? When I see Christian rulers of Jerusalem, I see them granting tolerances to Muslims. You get this kind of odd thing. And then, of course, I jump all the way forward to the 6-Day War, right? Well, what do we see again, right? The Israelis have the city. You can do with it whatever you want, right? Rabbi Goren is, let's deal with it now, right? Allegedly. And no, we're going to retain these rights. And so that's why I see this thread is very interesting. That over and over again, whether the city is small, whether it is large, whatever the population is like, with a few exceptions, you've got people finding a way to somehow live next to each other.
So this argument of yours, now that was thread throughout the book, we mentioned a bunch of times, was that kind of why you wanted to write the book? I mean, is that what you're trying to do here? What was your, I don't know if we discussed, kind of the why to write the book.
So some people might not believe me when I say this, but I actually came about this, what I would call through academic honesty. And here's what I mean by that. I decided to teach a course at the Command and General Staff College on, the course was given to me. It was an elective called Deep Roots of Conflict in the Middle East. And, talk about a subject, right? Wow. I mean, okay, where do you start? And I said, well, I don't know where to start with this. I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to build the course around Jerusalem. Why don't we just use that as like a focal point? And we'll start in the ancient period. I started with David. I started in the Old Testament and went all the way forward to the Ottomans. I said, let's just see what are the roots of these conflicts? What are the Jewish claims to the cities? What is the Christian claim? What is the Muslim claim? We did all that. And the more I taught that class and the more I assigned documents and just talked with the students, we just kept finding things and they'd be saying things like, professor, it doesn't seem like it was that awful. I'm like, really? And we look at the document again, I'm like, yeah, I'm like, but there's this, there's the first crusade, we like, yeah, but what about this right after? It seems like, and more we just kept finding these moments where people seem to be tolerating each other. And I didn't see conflict. I saw this coexistence, to use the conflict or coexistence, phrase. And I started thinking about it. I said, you know what, I'm going to investigate this a little bit more. And so I started reading the sources more. I said, you know what, I think my students and I have kind of tripped on something here. I think this might be reality. And so when I say I come to it honestly, I didn't come to it trying to push that this is a theme or to push that the other way was a theme. I really wanted to know. I said, I just want to read and see. I've got to, cops get the feeling in their, the gut feeling, right? Historians get this little twitch, at least I do, in the back of my head where I think I'm onto something. And I wanted to know if I was right. And the more I read, I said, I'm convicted by this from what I'm reading. And so that's how the book came about. And then I wrote the proposal and pitched it, to a publisher. And the whole time as I was doing it, I was tried to be very cognizant of, I could be wrong, right? I might be wrong. And, you find this, okay, well, here's a document that suggests something else. And so I was trying to do right by it. And I will say I was rosier at the beginning than I was at the end. I thought there was more peace than what I actually found. I still think the theme is peace. But it got adjusted as I went through. Because you do find these other things. You're like, oh, I tell the story of Patriarch John in the 900s who, gets an argument. They burn him alive in the Sepulchre Church. It's like, that's clearly not a good thing. And okay, so how do we build that in? So it really came for it was a great moment. Myself and my students, looking at documents in a seminar, hashing them out and thinking we maybe put our finger on historical reality. Maybe.
And as you mentioned, one reviewer already didn't like it, and I'm sure I'll hear from listeners. Listeners can email me, or they can email you. Do you want to mention if any listeners want to reach out to you if they have any pushback on? I'd be happy to. That'd be fine. Yeah, and I even say in the introduction, I'm like, there's not everyone's going to agree with this. I mean, and I welcome. Good historians should welcome the critique because if you think you've got the answer, you're wrong. Because all that happens, you pull up a new document and somebody says, "Yeah, but did you read this?" Oh. Right. And instantly everything falls apart. So I think my intent is it doesn't really matter to me if I prove what I'm arguing. What my interest is when we talk about Jerusalem, can it get to the point, my hope is, where we talk about the conflict and talk about the coexistence? Can we talk about them both when we teach it, when we read about it, when we discuss it? That for me would make me very happy. Even if nobody buys it and says, Hosler, I think there's still more fighting. Okay, fine. But now do you know more about the coexistence? And if you do, then I'll consider that a victory. Because, life's not black and white. It was an unending conflict. They did get along at some times. And so let's talk about both of it because that's a nice story. If you step back and say, wow, in these really tumultuous times, you're talking about the days of Muhammad, the days of the Crusades, these horrible, brutal things. And if people could get along then, well, maybe there's a lesson in there. I don't know. I mean, historians, we don't like to pitch lessons, right? That's not my job. But I like to think maybe there's a lesson. Okay. And we'll mention you have a website, johnhosler.com. So if and listeners want to contact you, anyone has any comments or feedback for you, I don't know if you have your email or can they contact you, go over there to contact you?
It's a great question. I don't know. I've got him. I'm pretty easy to find on Twitter. Direct messages with, that and whatnot. I've gotten some feedback already. one was very negative. Somebody came out swinging, I had to block him. I felt terrible. But you write about Jerusalem, and when the book got approved, one of the reviewers actually suggested that I turn off my social media accounts when it got published, because the thunder was going to come down, and my life might just be easier if I lived in ignorance. And I still have them on right now, but I always have the option.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a very nice read, a very nice overview historically. Those that are familiar, and we've mentioned the argument that you have, but other than that, again, it's a really nice book and overview in history of that. Now, I will link to your website in the show's notes. I will link to the book in the show's notes for those interested. I can link to your Twitter account also once you mention that as well in the show's notes. I will mention that I think I mentioned the other book as you've mentioned, the Siege of Acre, 1189-1191. So that's really kind of crusade stuff. But I don't know if listeners are interested. If this is still interesting to people, I don't know. Maybe we can do another episode on that if people are interested in that kind of thing.
Absolutely, and it won't shock you to think that I found the same kind of stuff there. Soldiers, Muslims hanging out with each other, playing games, talking. It's life is people are very complex, and I just find these interpersonal things where you can find them just so interesting. And it's hard in medieval studies because very often the sources are being written by elites, by and large. You don't always get a good bead on what's going on with the common person. But when you do, when you get a chance to look underneath it, it really is fascinating. So I'd be happy to talk about Acre. It's a fun subject.
Okay, now one other thing about the book, other than your argument, but the actual book, this time period, 7th, 13th centuries, have there been other books like this done before, or this is something unique that this book brings?
So there are a lot of histories of Jerusalem. The most, I think probably the most famous is Simon Sebag Montefiore's Jerusalem biography, which I actually assign in class. What I find though is that's a great read. Most of the other books I found in the history of the city tend to be kind of like that. They're like the whole span, right? So they'll kind of start at the beginning and go all the way up to the modern day. There are some collections, like academic collections, that center on medieval Jerusalem. I think I'm the first one to try to tell this coherent narrative of this period, just centering on the city. I think. I could be wrong. There's always something you haven't read before. But most of them tend to take the much longer, broader view. And if you're looking for that, boy, there are no shortage of titles. I mean, there's popular treatments, academics, there's archaeological treatments. Eric Klein wrote a great book about the archaeological history of Jerusalem from the beginning to the end. There's lots of them out there. I have a ton of them in the bibliography. But as the Middle Ages is kind of, I really think it's the lacuna. It's the part that gets skipped because what happened in the year 70 is so shocking and so consequential. It demands intensive study. And then, the Middle Ages, it kind of falls off the radar until the Crusades. And so textbooks will jump in and, okay, well, the Crusades, Jerusalem's important. And then they leave it again. So that was another part of my ambition. Just, it'd be nice to just have a nice narrative of what's going on in the city. And I don't claim that it's comprehensive, but just, blow by blow, here you go. Here's what happened over the course of 7 centuries.
And what are you working on next? Do you have any plans? Are you going to stay in the region or are you going to go back to England?
So I'm thinking of doing something that combines both of them. And I don't have it ready yet. I'm scheming right now. But something that has to do with kind of joining the two worlds together, because one thing I found when I was writing this book is if you read the Western sources from the period, you get a very different image of Jerusalem than if you read the Eastern sources. They're like two different cities because one area is in the know. They have the information. They're there. They see what's going on. And the other is, I don't want to say they're ignorant because they're not. They're getting messengers back and forth and they're getting information, but there's such a distance, between Paris and Jerusalem, just two different views of the world. And so if I can find a way to kind of reconcile those a little bit, and I might do it through kind of the lens of travelers, people who were in both places. And so I'm kind of playing with that idea. What did somebody who was hanging out in Jerusalem and then he goes back to Rome and he talks to this person and then, this person ends up back. How did images of the city and the region in general change depending on where you were in when? That's kind of what I'm playing with.
Okay. Sounds really interesting. All right. And thank you very much. for joining me to discuss the book and Jerusalem and its history of the, I guess, Middle Ages.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was fun. I appreciate it.